Welcome to Tales from the Bridge, everyone. This is part one of a conversation with David Zindell, and I have to say, this was just an absolute treat. The conversation just really went places I don't think any of us thought it would go, and we all kind of inspired each other, so I hope you enjoy this. So, let's make our way over to the bridge.
David, it's a real honor to meet you. I've been reading your books since high school. I found Neverness at a bookstore, probably in the early '90s, and I think it might have even been my first science fiction book.
Really?
And it really grabbed me. And then I read it again 10 years later in grad school sometime, and I thought, wow, it's still just as good as in high school. And then 10 years after that, when we did this for the book club, I recommended it to the other guys. And now I've read a lot of science fiction in that time, and I kept wondering, is it still going to stand up? And it's still my favorite book. I love this book. It inspires me every time I read it. And I've read the rest of the Requiem for Homo Sapiens, and I love that too. And I'm happy to report that the other guys in the book club also loved your book. So it's not just me, and not just I was a young, impressionable young man when I first read it, but we're really big fans. And so thank you for coming on the show with
Well,
us.
thanks for saying that. That's a pretty heavy, long, dense science fiction novel for your first.
Yeah, I guess it was, yeah. But I've often been, I mean, maybe it set up my expectations for the rest of my reading career, but I'm always nothing ever quite reaches quite as high as in terms of reaching for the big issues and asking big questions, and I just really appreciate that your writing is so unapologetically philosophical and reaches for things like the meaning of life and death, and so I have never found that in any other book, so that's why I love it.
Yeah, I don't really understand that because it seems to me everybody on some level is concerned with these things. I mean, most people have some sort of religion. I don't know how much they practice it, but many, many people go to church. Many, many people read books on spirituality or self-help, things like that. Probably everyone asks on a bad day, what's this all about?
Right.
Is it just, life's a bitch and then you die? So I think most people have asked, what the meaning of life is at some point. Where do we go when we die, or do we go anywhere? Does it make sense to be an atheist or a pantheist or a deist or whatever? And so I don't really understand why more writers wouldn't write about this, since it's probably at the core of what many people are concerned with.
Absolutely. I mean, we've been reading a lot of contemporary authors, and we've noticed that there's a number who have successfully launched their writing careers by publishing independently before joining a publishing house, like Becky Chambers, or maintained independence after launching on unconventional platforms, like the Dennis E. Taylor of the Bobiverse. I think he launched through Audible, and he publishes his own books. So your career has moved in the opposite direction, from being with big publishers 30 years ago to self-publishing today, as far as I can tell. Can you tell us more about that trajectory and comment on the rise of self-publishing and the success possibly of self-publishing?
Yeah, the first thing to say here is I am not an expert on this, and I'm still trying to figure out the self-publishing world and actually the traditional publishing world. And the thing is that I don't know if anybody can figure it out, because it doesn't hold still. It always seems to be different to me, from month to month even,
Uh,
let alone year to year. The first thing to say is, though, I'm not quite I haven't just quite moved from traditional publishing to self-publishing, because in the United Kingdom and British Commonwealth, and which is still a good part of the world, I am traditionally published through my publisher HarperCollins, and indeed they are going to be bringing out another Neverness novel
oh,
in whenever they get around to it, basically.
Oh, that's exciting.
huh?
Yeah, I'm excited. As with a lot of publishers, their lists were all jammed up because of the pandemic. So I think it'll probably be about a year before that book comes out. So I think I'm what they call a hybrid author right now. So publishing partly in UK traditionally, and also my books in translation. I just got a request from Russia to relicense and republish Neverness. So those are still traditional models. For the self-published models or books, that's a whole different world for me. And being an older guy, I don't necessarily feel like I have a real good feel for it yet, and I'm still making my way through that. It seems to be a very different model from traditional publishing.
Right. And so, is it in the States that you self-publish mostly? And why is that, the States versus the UK? Do you have a sense of?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It has to do with things that happened in my career historically. I had a huge disaster with U.S. publishers about 20 years ago, and that propagated and made it so that I don't think I would be a very good author for most U.S. publishers right now, and they wouldn't be good publishers for me. Oh. So because of that, then I thought, okay, self-publishing is working for a lot of people, then I should give that a try. But it's a very different model. The basic model that I'm used to is, for traditional publishing would be write a good novel every year, publish it, write another one, be represented by an agent, have a publisher that really gets behind you, and then that's where you make a career. With self-publishing, what I've been advised is the best model is to pick not just a genre, but a subgenre. I don't know, gay vampire novels, let's say, and write 4 books a year. Build your market, build your email list, so you have faithful followers who will write reviews, get many reviews posted on Amazon, Goodreads, other platforms, and then just build your career that way. And that model is not going to work for me. It doesn't really allow for longer books, which for the most part I've written, and the pace is just really fast. Right. So 4 books a year, I don't think that I could do that, and I don't think that I want to do that.
Right.
So when it does,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, when it does come to just Neverness and the publishers, and you said about 20 years ago that kind of changed. Would that be like a contract that expires and then you say, okay, so it's not working, I'm going to start self-publishing? Or is it like, how did that transition happen? Because the copy I have is the Bantam Spectra. It's, I believe it would have been late 80s or early 90s, maybe around. It's the pocket paper. Yeah, it's the same one Marty's got there.
Yeah.
Mine, by the way, is so well read that it is in half. It's broken in half because after I got it from Marty, I read it and then I handed it to a friend, and he, as he got through it, it broke in half. So I think a sign of a good book is it's broken because it's been read so many times, and this is one of them. But yeah, how
you on my bookshelf like that?
Beautiful. So yeah, so does the I'm not sure if the contract is the right word for when you're with the publisher, but does that kind of expire and you say, okay, so I don't need to renew, I'm going to move to self-publishing these books, or what's that transition like?
Basically, after I finished Requiem for Homo Sapiens, this huge trilogy that was a successor to pretty long first novel, I did a lot of what I wanted to do at that time in science fiction. And indeed, in science fiction, I was coming up against the limits of science fiction, because at that time, and continuing forward, but there was a very strong belief in nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. And if you extrapolate nanotechnology and artificial intelligence out pretty far, not necessarily very far in time, but just pretty far in terms of their power, then science fiction sort of stops, because you can remake worlds through nanotechnology in a matter of days. You know, there's that idea of the gray goo, gray mat, that if you release the nanotechnology would convert the whole biosphere to this, you know, just this gob of goo. Artificial intelligence, of course, within a matter of minutes of actually becoming self-aware, could then turn itself into a functional God. And so these elements, if you really incorporated them into a science fiction novel to their logical extreme, it became very fantasy-like. You know, it's like, if you can do so much, if you can do almost anything, it's like you can do nothing. So there's no constraints on the fiction, and that was disturbing to me. So I took a step back and I said, okay, if these elements, you know, if these tropes like artificial intelligence can essentially produce a fantasy-like powers, why not just write a fantasy? So this was at the end of the 1990s when I was finishing up my books, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write a big fantasy. So that's what I did. The Aya cycle. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was a huge 4-book fantasy series, you know, and they were popular at that time. And so I thought, this is not only a good career move, but then I can write in, oh, you have it. Okay. Yes.
Have to hold that upside down to get that.
You've got the lights in. So I thought this would be not only a good career move, but I could just have fun with fantasy. And writing fantasy is very freeing, as opposed to writing science fiction, because there's, well, first of all, I would do an incredible amount of research for my science fiction. You know, science, mathematics, you know, anthropology, to different types of cultures. I mean, a lot went into my science fiction. A lot went into my fantasy too, but not quite as much. So there was more of a freedom to tell pure stories. So my first novel that you were holding up there, The Lightstone, I sold that on a proposal to a publisher, to my publisher in the United Kingdom, who of course is, you know, always been behind me and had my back, but also to Warner Books here in the US. And my agent was very excited, and just on the basis of proposal, came up with a really good deal. It was like, you know, close to $1 million for 4 books. And I go, oh wow, now I'm going to be like George Martin. But at that time, of course, remember, George Martin was just selling, you know, Song of Ice and Fire, and there was no TV series, so he wasn't world famous. So I just thought, okay, you know, I'll do a major work in fantasy. And so I was pretty happy about all that. I was pretty happy with The Lightstone. So what happened is that right around the time I turned in the novel, Warner was merged with AOL. Time AOL. Warner, they totally bungled the new company, and their stock fell from like 72 to 18. Ted Turner, who owned the company, picked up his shoe at the meeting. You know, stockholders pounded on the table and was like yelling at everybody. So long story short, the inside story I got is that the word went out that they had to cut costs wherever they could, and that meant cutting some big authors. And I was one of those. And so my editor, Betsy Mitchell, who originally acquired the novel, moved on. A different editor took over, and then they asked me to cut The Lightstone by 27%. And I spent 6 months doing that, you know, literally shrinking words to you know, so the paragraphs wouldn't be too long. And at the end of that time, my new editor sent me a letter rejecting the novel on the very basis that they had acquired. All her reasons for saying why this was an unpublishable novel were actually why the novel was acquired in the first place. So these were just kind of BS reasons, and they were just going to cut me loose no matter what they did. And all their business about requesting revision, it was just all covering their tracks to do what essentially was a dirty deal, a dirty deed on their part. And as a result of that, I was left high and dry. They weren't going to publish my books. And so that put me in a very bad position. And then I resold to Tor, but of course the way publishing worked at that time, and pretty much still does work, is that there's positive buzz and negative buzz. Positive buzz, you're on top of the world, and people are offering you big contracts and coming out behind you in a big way with promotions, interviews like this. And then on the other side of it is the negative buzz, and then it's like you become almost an untouchable. So my books were picked up by Tor, but they did not do well, and that experience soured me to traditional publishing in the United States. So big long answer, but that's the ugly story.
That's really interesting. That it's something I've wondered since being introduced to your work and seeing your website and your books. Marty's got a couple of the self-published books, and it's really neat to have an answer. Thank you so much, David. That's very interesting. It almost sounds like the story almost sounds like the Hollywood story, where you can pick up a new star and drop them like nothing. The only thing is, with an author, you've already invested so much work.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, so Warner had not invested anything in me beside their advance.
Right.
At that point, they had done no career building. They hadn't, helped me along. So, I started with Bantam. Actually, I started with a very, very small publisher called Donald I. Fine, who acquired the rights to Neverness for the hardcover. And then those rights were sold to Bantam. But Warner was a whole different entity. I didn't know any of those people, except I knew Betsy Mitchell, just through the science fiction community. But in terms of, a publisher and her superiors, I didn't know any of the people. And it was a huge shock for me, a very unpleasant exposure to how the corporate takeover of publishing had wrecked so much about that world that I had grown up with and had loved.
Well, I'm sad to hear that story. I can imagine that was not a great time.
Other authors have worse stories, and that's the thing. That's one of the things that has soured me to traditional publishing, is that it doesn't. You don't have to go too far to hear these types of stories.
Well, maybe this will be slightly corrected by the rise of self-publishing, and these publishing houses will now have to compete against, new entities like Audible. I mean, I think it's really interesting what's happening there, where, like Dennis E. Taylor, he put out his book in Audible first, and then he just owns all the printing rights himself, I guess, and he just self-publishes the actual books. But you sort of rise to popularity through audiobook, and then
I'm familiar with that. With that experience, and a little surprised, because my understanding of putting out an audiobook is that either you have to pay for the whole thing up front yourself as a self-published author, or you can find people who are willing to kind of like split that cost with you, and then they'll actually record the book and do all the sound engineering and all that, and then on that basis, you have like a partner, kind of like a publisher as your partner in some sense. But in that case, usually those people who will do that want to see big sales, or at least sufficient sales, so they know they're going to recoup their costs. So do you happen to know if Dennis just financed that whole thing by himself? Because it's pretty expensive to get someone to read a whole book for you on
Yeah, not exactly sure how he did that. I had just read that Audible read the book that he printed himself because it got good reviews at the beginning of being on Amazon. And then and they kind of picked it up to just have the rights. And I don't know the details on the paper editions, except for they look. I've got a copy up here. It looks like it's just owned by him and printed by him. I don't see any other companies besides the printing company. But that's interesting. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into that just to kind of find out the details, because that's a neat situation that might be evolving with the internet right now, and the fact that people are driving and listening to books more. They're going for long walks or jogs and listening to books more, and podcasts. So it's I think we're transitioning into a new time and a new format for listeners, and instead of being readers.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in terms of paths in publishing or towards publishing, since everything's changing, I think there's going to be more maybe stories like Dennis's.
Well, and also I've noticed, I think the first self-published book I ever got, and I didn't even realize it was self-published, was your collection of short stories, Shanidar.
Oh, okay.
I just ordered it on Amazon. I didn't really look into the details. I was very excited to finally find a copy of Shanidar because I'd never read the short story. And then it showed up, and it was pretty clearly self-published, and I thought it was wonderful. I mean, I think it's more valuable to me, right? If it comes from you and you get more of the profit or all of the profit, or then I think that's pretty exciting to have that on my shelf, and maybe other people are going to start thinking that way too.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Some of those stories had been published previously, and a couple of them were new.
Yeah, I love the new one. That was the tiger, right? The last one in the.
Yeah.
I love that story. I love that you said about it that this was the story you were born to write, because you've been writing about that poem since Neverness, right? It plays a key role in Neverness, so it was wonderful to see you write more around, the tiger burning bright. I love that story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that scene in a different form made it into my new Neverness novel.
So wait, when you say a new Neverness novel, you don't mean a new edition of Neverness? You mean another?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So So technically, I have Neverness, and then there's Requiem for Homo Sapiens.
Yeah.
But then, as a self-published author, I just thought, okay, I've got to make it clear that these are all together. So now I'm just calling him the Neverness. What am I calling it? Neverness cycle. I don't know what I'm calling.
I see. Okay.
The Neverness something, but Neverness book. So I've written a new book in that series, if you want.
Oh, wow.
Amazing. Well, that's the biggest news we've had all day or week. What's wonderful.
Oh, yes. So
fantastic.
Does that mean we're getting Mallory Ring-esque stories? Or are we continuing with Danlo, or what's going on there then?
Good questions. Mallory Ring-esque, no. Danlo, he's sort of off stage. He's a big presence, but not appearing in the novel because he's such a amazing character. And by amazing character, I don't mean I've just created this, excuse me, great character. I mean, he's amazing in the powers that he's achieved. And I feel like if he were present in the novel, he would be eclipsing other characters. So he is not, no, this is a story of a character that played a significant but minor part in the other novels. Thomas Rain, the Remembrancer.
Oh, yeah.
So the title of the novel is called The Remembrancer's Tale. And it's a story of lost love. It's the story of how Thomas Rain, through his fantastic memory, literally tries to recreate a woman that he's lost.
Ah, wow. Well, that's super exciting.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. And then that's a novel I was referring to earlier that HarperCollins is going to be putting out in a year or whenever they get around to it.
Oh, and are they English then, HarperCollins?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's HarperCollins in the United States. I mean, I don't know of any of these companies anymore, specifically English or American or whatever, but HarperCollins UK is going to be publishing that novel.
Well, that is very exciting. Wow.
Great.
Yeah, I'm excited about that because I took some of the ideas of, Requiem for Homo Sapiens and kind of tried to go one step further. There was so much happening at the end of the book. It's almost hard to say, okay, how much further could I take this? But nevertheless, I tried to do that, and yeah, I'm pretty excited about it.
I imagine we get some, is it the Agathenians? Am I saying that right?
The way I say it is Agathanians.
Agathenians. So if someone's trying to create someone's memory, I'm sorry, I'm trying to predict things now. I'm getting excited, but I hope we see a little bit of that world. If not, okay. But
there is a reference to it, but actually, not giving too much away. Let me just say that the solid state entity, Kalinda, former warrior poet, or always warrior poet, however you want to look at her, is going to play a major role in this novel.
Oh, fantastic!
Wow.
She's one of our favorite characters of all time.
Well, I hope in bringing her closer to the reader, closer to the flesh, I don't make her too, what's the right word? Too non-mysterious.
Right.
That's the way to say it.
Yeah.
Did you ever read any of the Hannibal books?
I have not. I actually have two on my shelf here that I've been thinking. I don't have Silence of the Lambs, so I wanted to start there, but I have not gone into those yet.
Is that what you mean, the Hannibal book?
Yeah. So in Silence of the Lambs, you just have this great evil genius who also has these wonderfully redeeming characteristics. Hannibal Lecter, he goes around killing and eating people. That's not so great, right? But he also has a code, eat the rude. Manners are incredibly important. I think if somebody treated him nicely, or that's not the right word, with respect and courtesy, that's his big word, courtesy. If someone treated him with courtesy, he'd never eat him, basically. Well, how does a character that's so fantastic and strange and evil come about? And quite frankly, I didn't want to know. I just wanted him to be mysterious. But in the later books, it's all explained. And I feel like too much explanation can sort of like kill a really mysterious, interesting character. So I had to walk that line with presenting Kalinda. I didn't want to explain Kalinda, but neither did I want to have her be quite as mysterious and otherworldly, literally otherworldly, or othermoonly with her moon brains. I want to do something more than that. So I will be very glad if you can tell me what you think about how good or bad a job I did.
Great, yeah. I wanted to circle back to what you said about the limits of sci-fi with AI and nanotechnology. I've specifically noticed in our reading over the last few years that I really enjoy 80s sci-fi and early 90s even. Basically, I guess for me, it comes to pre-William Gibson. And I love William Gibson. But once sci-fi sort of went into the computer, then once we started, everything was AI, everything was computational, everything was, the magic sort of got lost for me, especially with when I compare your vision of traveling through space-time by doing active mathematical proofs, to tunnel through the manifold. I love that, and that's sort of what I consider, I guess, analog sci-fi, right? It was before everything was just a machine that we already understand, and now, all the spaceships we see, they're just spaceships with engines and a really good computer that can calculate trajectories, and it sort of lost a lot of the magic for me, and I realized what I love about your fiction and sort of earlier, this sort of 80s, early 90s science fiction is, I guess it qualifies more as science fantasy, and that's sort of what you said, right? That you're sort of approaching fantasy with the power. Once you have nanotech and AI, you can do anything, and it sort of makes the story less interesting to me anyway. So anyway, along that note, I was wondering would you consider your work science fantasy? Is that a genre that you kind of put yourself in then? Because I've noticed that my favorite three books are your book, Neverness, Dune, and Hyperion. And when I think about it, those are all kind of science fantasy, right? They don't have the AI and the computers. They're sort of analog in a different way that science fiction used to be. So do you... I don't know. Do you orient yourself inside that kind of community of writers?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've lately just tried real hard not to want to put my work or any work necessarily into boxes and say it's this, it's that. I'm actually, I've actually written some other novels since the fantasy books. I don't know if you're aware of the Orca Song, which is my novel. And then I've recently completed one, which I'll be self-publishing soon, called If I Am God. And so these are novels that have some science fictional elements, some fantasy elements, but what I've discovered is that there's actually a category, and this is actually an Amazon subcategory. It's very hard to find, but it's actually called visionary fiction. So in some sense, I think if I had to just pick a category and say, what would my work fit into, it would be that category. But there's a problem with that because, I mean, doesn't visionary fiction sound pretentious? Oh, I'm David Zindell, I'm writing visionary fiction. It's like I'm some kind of, prophet or seer or something like that. So in that sense, I don't like that word, but in terms of what visionary fiction is supposed to accomplish, it's just what we were talking about earlier, some of the big things, big questions, meaning of life, but even more than that, transcendence, what's the next step for human beings? And by that, I don't mean just, biologically or ecologically or physically, but I mean, in some kind of, I don't want to use the word spiritual here because that, again, is a fraught word. It's freighted with all these meanings that I don't necessarily like, but, it's I guess you would say it's the human soul striving to be more, and which seems to be very much part of the human condition. And so visionary fiction, as I understand it, is its own genre, but it's not, because certain works within science fiction will be visionary fiction. Certain works within fantasy will be also. So it gets kind of confusing. Certain works within classical mainstream fiction. Hermann Hesse, his works would be described as visionary fiction, many of them at least. And so that is the direction I'm moving, of just saying, okay, here's what I want to write, and maybe call it visionary fiction, but it's going to be just like what I want to write. And if it doesn't quite fit into a category, then I'm still going to write it.
Yeah. Well, I love that term, actually. That really resonates with me. I think you've sort of put your finger on it, but what I love about your work is that it's inspiring, right? It feeds my soul. I love to contemplate and actually get some answers once in a while on these big questions, like what is the meaning of life? I love that you tackle that and actually give a number of different answers in Neverness. I've heard the term speculative fiction lately for some new authors. N.K. Jemisin, particularly. She's written fantasy, then she wrote the Broken Earth trilogy, was very successful, won 3 Hugos and a Nebula for that series. And it doesn't quite fit either, I find, right? I think speculative fiction is a good term for that. But now that I think of it, it's also very different from what you're talking about. It's not visionary. It's not sort of taking us forward into the future of humanity in at least a positive way. Maybe it's a dark world that she describes.
I've been meaning to read her work. It's like high on my list. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But if you recommend it, then I will.
The Broken Earth trilogy is amazing. I just heard a rumor the other day that it's going to be getting the big screen treatment already. So you better read it before it comes out as a movie.
Fantastic. Yeah, before all that happens.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I fully answered your question about Dune being like a science fantasy, but I agree it is, and I would say if there's one book that motivated me or inspired me, it would be Dune. Inspired me as a science fiction author. It would be Dune because of all those elements and the way everything was put together. I mean, I think there's a reason that Dune is rated the best science fiction novel of all time.
Are there other books like that then, other authors, while we're talking about it, that inspired you or that are your favorites today? Or
Oh yeah, I've got plenty. Do you, in the genre or outside the genre? Or?
well, let's start inside the genre, and then we can move our way out.
Inside the genre, going way back, and you know, when an author cites their literary influences, you know, I think that some authors want to actually cite works that are literary
Mm-hmm.
and not pulpy, but
Right.
I can't do that. I'm not going to make that distinction. I mean, some of these are not well written, but by a lot of standards, but were inspiring stories for me. So have you read Doc Smith, all the Lensman books? And okay, so these are the books that really started space opera, and they're cheesy, but they're just so imaginative with these fantastic things happening. So they were big. Tarzan novels.
Huh.
They were. I mean, I read them all, and Tarzan is a superhero. He actually is more of a Nietzschean Superman. He's got his own moral code that he's developed through, you know, growing up among apes. He's, of course, you know, physical Superman. But more than that, you know, the movies, almost all the movies depictions of Tarzan, you know, he's like the Johnny Weissmuller grunting monosyllabic Tarzan. But in the books, that's not true. He actually teaches himself to read, having never heard English, by having like a picture book with some letters, and he puzzles out the meanings of those letters without ever hearing the sound. So that's a work of, you know, superhuman intellect, essentially.
Interesting.
He learns French before he learns English, so he can read in English and speak French, and has no idea how to speak these, you know, child primer picture books that he found in his parents' cabin in equatorial Africa. And so he was a huge influence on me. He's the noble savage, but, you know, the savage part is, you know, the Nietzschean life energy. The noble part is the, yeah, I mean, here's what do we do? How do we transcend? How do we become the Superman, or, you know, to be non-gendered super person?
Mm-hmm.
So he was huge.
Well, I can see that. That's an amazing thing that you've just told us, because I can now see where the Alloy, is that how you say it? The Alloy?
How I say it.
Where that whole part of your fiction comes from, right? The noble savage, as you said.
Yeah, these things go way back, you know. Lord of the Rings, of course. Yeah, I think it'd be impossible not to be influenced by that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've noticed that even in the structure, the Neverness is sort of like the Hobbit and the Requiem for Homo sapiens is kind of like the Lord of the Rings, at least to me, right? You've got this sort of the father-like character in the first one as an introduction, and then you follow the story of the son, kind of like Bilbo and Frodo in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, actually, that's true. There is that connection, although Tolkien conceived of the Lord of the Rings as just one big novel, and then for publication purposes, just divided into three. I had three really different models for each of the books of Requiem for Homo sapiens.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
The first one was going to be a Bildungsroman, not novel of education, you know, mm-hmm. which was always a model for me, and very interested in those novels. Great Expectations was a novel, Pip's Education, Damien by Hermann Hesse, same thing. So that was always of interest to me. The second book, The Wild, was just going to be a quest novel. You know, let's go out on a quest. So, you know, essentially continuing the quest of Neverness, just spread over a whole book. And then War in Heaven is going to be my war novel. And so I thought, okay, this will be a good structure for this trilogy. I'm not sure how well that worked as an integrated structure, but that was my intent. So Lord of the Rings, everything you said about, you know, father and son, and, you know, there was that aspect of it.
Interesting. Sorry, I interrupted. So Lord of the Rings, what else? Is there something more you want to tell us?
Jack Vance, the Dying Earth
Jack
books.
Vance. Yeah.
And of course, he influenced Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe, his stories were and also his novels, the torture novels were a big influence on me.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an influence on me because he was my first teacher. I did a workshop with Gene, and he taught me many things in a very short period of time.
How did that come about, the workshop and working with Gene? Because that was actually something Marty and I were talking about recently. And how did that connection, where'd that start?
I think my ex-wife was going through one of the science fiction magazines and discovered that there was going to be a workshop on the coast of Oregon. It was kind of like a mini Milford, so it was 3 weeks long. It was taught by 3 instructors, 1 instructor per week. There was Ed Bryant, Michael Bishop, and Gene Wolfe. And so the structure, or I guess you'd call it the structure of the workshop, is that we were assigned essentially a whole story to write per day. So wow. I probably wrote, I don't know, and it didn't quite come out to that because that's really hard to do for anybody. So I think I wrote 11 stories out of the 15 active days of writing, which was a lot. And they weren't all long stories, but obviously, because you don't have time to do that. So we would meet in the morning and we would sit around in a circle critiquing the story from the night before. So, all the authors present would have their say, and then, Gene Wolfe or Michael Bishop, whoever was teaching that week, would have final say about the story. And then the author would get to explain or defend. And so that would go till about noon. And then I'd take a long nap because, as you'll see, I needed it. And then around 3, I would get up and we'd have a story assignment. I'd go for a walk on the beach. Cannon Beach is this broad, wonderful, clean, spectacular beach. And I'd walk for an hour and we'd have a story assignment. One of the story assignments was tell a story set on a world where some basic law of physics or chemistry has changed, but you can't say outright. The reader has to figure it out. And so that became a story. And so walking on the beach, I would generate these ideas. And then around 6 or 7, after dinner, probably more like 6, 7, then I'd start writing a story, and I'd write clear through sometimes till 4 or 5 in the morning, and then take a really short nap again, and then get up and do our workshop. And so that was 3 weeks of intense writing.
Wow.
And I think it was that experience that made me into a professional author, with more of a professional author's take on things. And 2 of the stories were published. My first published story came out of that workshop, and also one of the stories in Shenandoah, the Caverns story. So they came out of that workshop.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Was this the Clarion West workshop, or I keep hearing about this?
They were modeled on Clarion.
Okay.
Yeah. I said Milford because Milford was kind of what started, but
okay.
Then along came Clarion, and there was a Clarion West and a Clarion East. The Clarion was in Michigan, I believe, and the Clarion West would be, somewhere in the West. Mm-hmm. And Clarion 6 weeks long, 6 authors teaching, but this was 3 weeks, so kind of like a half Clarion.
Yeah. Neat. No, I'm always amazed at these workshops, because every time I pick up a biography of an author, it seems they've done one of these. There's this long chain of what do you call it? Legacy, I guess. Mentorship, right, from sort of successful authors to newer authors.
Yeah. So that's the Gene Wolfe connection. Then there's More Than Human by Ted Sturgeon.
Oh yeah.
Is another transcendent. Let's create a group human mind that has powers beyond what humanity has. And have I mentioned The Star Is My Destination by Alfred Bester?
No. Bester, yeah.
Fantastic book. Possibly, I would say that that's in my top 3 science fiction books of all time.
I've just about a month ago finished The Demolished Man, and I realized that I think that inspired Philip K. Dick, just with the whole the minds and the reading of minds. And But I think Alfred Bester got there a little bit earlier, and I think he may have inspired Philip K. Dick, or maybe I'm assuming, but the dates kind of line up.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe someone got there sooner that we don't even know about. I mean, these things
True.
are hard to trace back.
Yeah.
Um,
So what about any recent authors? So who in the last 10 years do you see as someone new that's great? Are there young authors that are inspiring you or doing something that you think hasn't been done before? And then I guess also we've got a few Canadian authors up here that are interesting that we've been reading. And do any come to mind there?
I have not been keeping up on the field, just because of the constraints of my life mostly, but also because the times where I have read some, award-winning science fiction or fantasy in the last 10 years, I haven't been tremendously inspired by what I've read. And I don't know whether that's because I'm getting older and I'm more jaded, harder to please, more critical, however you want to say it, or just because the field is changing, moving away from what I regarded as its core being a sense of wonder. Or maybe I've just seen, artificial intelligence simulations used once too often. So really I have to plead ignorance there. And in terms of like my saying, okay, this is who I think is really exciting right now, and unfortunately I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, something I'm noticing with new science fiction authors is they're often, they're very simply written, but they're just really fun. And I think it's almost turning into a pulp thing, where you get an exciting book with a great story. It's fast paced and it's fun to read, but in no way does it have, so for myself, and I think Marty's in the same position here, where we want our brains to be challenged. We want lyrical writing. We want the big questions to be asked and maybe answered. And often that's not existing in these new big sellers and these new authors. We're kind of just getting these fast, fun stories, and they're still good. They're fun to complete a good, to complete a book is a challenge in itself, and to make it entertaining is a challenge. So it just seems like we're getting away from the art of writing in some ways, even though there are many authors still doing this. But it almost I wonder, the Marvel movies, to use an analogy here, they're fun movies. Are they good movies? Well, that's a different question, because they're super fun, they're action packed, they're great. But now compare it to the classics and those movies, and the movies that really either changed film. It's harder for, or I should say, it's easier for people to get into the fun movie than the one that actually challenges their personal beliefs or has them asking hard questions.
Well, I have a lot to say about that.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the end of part 1. Part 2 is available now, and I gotta say, part 2 of this conversation with David Zindell really takes off, so check it out. You're really gonna enjoy it.